An 80-year-old Korean War veteran was knocked to the concrete steps of a Veterans Affairs office in broad daylight. The man who put him there straightened his jacket, looked down at him and said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Do you know who my father is? He commands armies. This old man is nobody." Then he walked inside, and in the fifth row of my courtroom, in full dress uniform, 4 stars on each shoulder, sat the father, watching his son destroy the meaning of every single medal on his chest. If stories like this one matter to you, real moments where honor shows up and changes everything, I'd be glad to have you subscribe. I share these cases because I believe they still deserve to be told. Now let me tell you about Brandon Mercer and the general who loved his son enough to refuse to protect him. It was a crisp Wednesday morning when case number 22-V7A14 landed on my desk. I had been on the bench since early morning, working through routine matters, the usual business of a busy courtroom. And then I picked up that file, and I set down my coffee, and I did not pick it up again. The victim was Harold Washington, 80 years old, Korean War veteran, a man who had given this country his youth, his young, strong, capable years, and had asked for very little in return across the 8 decades that followed. The defendant was Brandon Mercer, 30 years old, son of General Raymond Mercer, one of the most decorated 4-star generals in the history of the United States Army. I read the incident report from beginning to end without stopping. Harold Washington had been to that VA office many times before. It was routine for him, the way that important appointments are routine for people who were raised to take obligations seriously. He arrived that morning the way he always did, deliberately, quietly, with his cane and his veteran's cap and the unhurried dignity of someone who stopped needing to prove himself to anyone a very long time ago. He was moving through the revolving door when Brandon Mercer came up behind him. Brandon was running late, not for anything urgent, not for anything that would justify what happened next under any reading of any standard of basic human decency, but late in the way that people who have never genuinely been made to wait experience lateness, as a personal affront, as something someone else has done to them. He told Washington to move faster. Washington, according to 3 separate witnesses who gave nearly identical accounts, turned slightly, apologized, and continued at his pace, the only pace available to an 80-year-old man with a twice-replaced hip navigating a revolving door with a cane. That was enough for Brandon Mercer. He shoved past him with both hands, not a brush, not an impatient nudge, a deliberate, forceful shove that sent Harold Washington's cane skittering across the concrete and took his legs out from under him. Washington hit the steps hard. His hip fractured on impact. His shoulder dislocated as he tried to break his fall. The laceration above his eye came from the edge of the step. He lay there on the concrete outside the building that exists specifically to serve men like him. And he did not cry out. Witnesses said he made almost no sound at all. Brandon Mercer looked down at him. He straightened his jacket. That detail appears in all 3 witness statements. The straightening of the jacket, as if that were the natural next gesture, as if nothing had happened that required anything else from him. Then he said it, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Do you know who my father is? He commands armies. This old man is nobody." And he walked inside. A bystander standing 10 feet away had been recording for 17 seconds before the shove. The phone captured everything: the shove, the fall, the jacket, the words, sharp, unambiguous, and undeniable. Harold Washington spent 5 days in the hospital, and by the time he was discharged, what had happened to him on those steps had reached every corner of this country. The footage was online before the ambulance arrived at the hospital. No caption, no commentary, just 17 seconds of video that needed neither. By midnight, millions of people had watched an 80-year-old Korean War veteran hit concrete steps outside a Veterans Affairs office while the man who put him there straightened his jacket and walked through the door. What followed was unlike anything I had ever seen attach itself to a case before it reached my courtroom. It was not simply outrage, though there was plenty of that. It was something deeper, something more specific. Veterans organizations released statements within hours. What struck me reading them was not the anger, it was the grief. Active duty service members, retired officers, Gold Star families, military spouses. The language they used, almost uniformly, was the language of mourning, as if something had been struck that went far beyond one elderly man on a set of concrete steps, as if the footage had made visible a particular wound, the wound of watching an entire generation's sacrifice be dismissed as nobody by someone who has never once been asked to sacrifice anything at all. General Mercer's name was trending nationally before dawn. His office issued a careful statement. It was read by millions and satisfied almost none of them. Charges were filed within 72 hours. By the morning of trial, my courtroom was the most heavily attended I had presided over in 30 years on this bench. Veterans sat in the gallery in uniform. Gold Star family members had driven hours to be present. Journalists filled every press seat, and over everything hung the particular stillness of people who have come not to watch a spectacle, but to bear witness to something that genuinely matters. I called the court to order and felt the full weight of every person in that room settle over the proceedings. Then the doors opened, and Brandon Mercer walked in. I have been doing this long enough to know that how a defendant walks through that door tells you almost everything before a single word is spoken. Brandon walked in dressed in a charcoal suit, fitted and precise, with the kind of upright posture that comes not from service, but from growing up around it. The inherited bearing of a man who has absorbed the look of discipline without ever being subject to its demands. His expression was carefully maintained. The practiced calm of someone who has decided that performing composure under pressure is the same thing as actually possessing it. He was accompanied by 4 attorneys. And then he passed Harold Washington. Washington was sitting in the gallery in his Korean War veteran's cap. His hip was in a brace that made sitting visibly uncomfortable. The faint mark of the laceration was still visible above his eye. He sat with the straight-backed quietude of a man who has learned, across a long and difficult life, that dignity is not something circumstances can take from you unless you surrender it yourself. Brandon Mercer passed within 4 feet of him and did not glance in his direction. Not a flicker of recognition, not a moment's pause, not the smallest acknowledgement that the man sitting there in a hip brace was the man he had left on a set of concrete steps. He passed him the way you pass a piece of furniture. I watched all of it from the bench. My glasses were off before Brandon Mercer reached the defense table. I called the case. His lead attorney was on his feet before the question finished leaving my mouth. I let him speak 2 sentences, and then I stopped him. "Counselor, I asked your client." Brandon straightened in his chair and looked at me with those carefully composed eyes. "Not guilty, Your Honor. Frankly, I think this charge is a significant overreaction to what was a very minor incident." I set my pen down. I let that phrase sit in the air for a moment. I wanted every person in that gallery to hear it fully before I responded. "Mr. Mercer," I said, "a man spent 5 days in a hospital. His hip is fractured. His shoulder was dislocated. Walk me through your definition of a minor incident, or shall we continue?" He continued. He described Harold Washington as a confused elderly man who had been blocking the entrance. He called what he had done incidental contact that unfortunately resulted in a fall. The gallery, which had been holding itself in rigid, controlled silence, shifted. A collective tightening, a fury so compressed it had nowhere to go. I came down from the bench. I walked past the defense table, past the bar, and into the gallery. And I stopped directly in front of Harold Washington. "Mr. Washington," I said, "would you please stand?" He stood. It took him a moment, The hip brace made it slow, and he needed his cane, and he did it the way he did everything, without complaint, without performance, with the full and quiet dignity of a man who survived a war at 19 years old and has been standing back up ever since. I turned to face Brandon Mercer. The courtroom was completely silent. "Look at this man," I said. "Look at him carefully, and then tell me again that he was nobody." Brandon looked. His expression did not change. Not a flicker, not a crack, not a single moment of recognition or remorse. The arrogance in that instant was so complete and so chilling that several people in the gallery looked away from him rather than from Washington. That told me everything I needed to know about what this case was going to require. And that was precisely when his lead attorney decided it was time to play the card he had been holding since the trial began. He rose with the practiced ease of a man who has spent a career making uncomfortable facts sound like reasonable questions. He spoke methodically. He suggested the footage angle created a misleading impression of force. He mentioned that the concrete steps presented an inherent instability risk for elderly individuals with mobility limitations. He noted Mr. Washington's medical history as relevant context. Each point delivered not as an argument, but as a suggestion, the legal equivalent of opening a window and letting doubt drift in on its own. And then, with the seamless transition of someone who had been building toward it from the very first sentence, he mentioned General Raymond Mercer, not as a threat, as context, a gentle reminder of the family into which this case had inserted itself. 40 years of decorated service, the institutional weight of the Mercer name, the particular complexity of prosecuting the son of a man who had given so much to the very country whose justice system was aimed aimed at his child. The implication moved through the gallery like smoke through a closed room, slow, pervasive, impossible to point to directly. I watched it reach the veterans sitting in their uniforms. I watched their jaws tighten. I watched it reach the Gold Star families, and I watched them look at their hands. Brandon straightened in his chair, the first loosening of tension I had seen in him since he walked through those doors. The relief of a man who believes the cavalry has just arrived. I let the attorney finish every sentence. I gave him the full conclusion of every point. And then I set down my pen, folded my hands on the bench, and looked past him to the gallery. "General Mercer," I said, "is he in this courtroom today? What happened next is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life on this bench." The silence that followed my question lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It felt considerably longer. From the 5th row of the gallery, a figure rose. Full dress uniform, 4 stars on each shoulder. Every decoration and commendation earned across 40 years of active service. Combat ribbons, distinguished service medals, honors from multiple administrations, arranged in precise gleaming rows across his chest. He stood at attention with the particular stillness of a man for whom bearing is not performance, but simply habit. Something that became part of him so long ago, he no longer thinks about it. The courtroom did not make a sound. Brandon turned in his chair. The relief drained from his face so completely and so rapidly that what replaced it looked almost like a different person sitting in that chair. General Mercer walked to the front of the courtroom without being directed. He stood before my bench with the specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for several days and has finally arrived at the place where he can set it down. He spoke without notes, without hesitation, without any of the careful, measured language that had characterized every public statement his office had released since the footage appeared. He said that his son had knocked a Korean War veteran to the ground outside a building that exists specifically to honor men like Harold Washington. He said there was no angle, no context, no legal reframing, and no consideration of family name or military rank that changed what was visible in that footage, or what it meant. Then he turned to face Harold Washington. He came to attention, sharply, formally, completely, and he rendered a salute. A four-star general in full dress uniform, delivering a formal military salute to an 80-year-old man in a veteran's cap and a hip brace. Washington received it with a stillness that was more eloquent than anything words could have managed. Then General Mercer faced me. Your Honor, do not soften this sentence on my account. My son will face every consequence this court provides. That is my order to him and my promise to you. The courtroom did not erupt. It did something rarer and more human than that. It wept. I gave the room a moment. Then I put my glasses back on, straightened the file in front of me, and looked at Brandon Mercer with the full and undivided attention this case had demanded from the moment that file landed on my desk. Mr. Mercer, I said. My voice was measured, deliberate. I have presided over this courtroom for a very long time. I have seen many young men sit where you are sitting, and in my experience, the ones who concern me most are not the ones who are frightened. I paused. The ones who concern me most are the ones who are not. You walked into this courtroom today without remorse, without acknowledgement, and without the faintest apparent understanding of what you actually did on those steps. I am going to ensure that understanding arrives, one way or another. I find you guilty of assault on an elderly person on all counts, without qualification and without any reduction in consideration of your family name or your father's rank. The lead attorney did not move. There was nothing useful left for him to do. Here is your sentence. You will serve 120 days in the county correctional facility. You will complete 400 hours of community service at VA hospitals and veteran care homes across this state. Not administrative work, not peripheral support. Direct, face-to-face service to the men and women whose sacrifices you dismissed as nobody. You will attend 1 year of mandatory psychological counseling. You will write, by hand, a formal letter of apology to Harold Washington. And you will read it aloud in this courtroom before you are remanded today. I let each element settle into the record and into the room. You will also record a public video statement, unscripted, unedited, with no attorney present, to be shared with veteran and military networks nationwide. And you will make a standing annual commitment, arranged through the VA, to speak at veteran outreach programs about privilege, inherited status, and the true cost of contempt. From the gallery, General Mercer spoke quietly, but clearly enough for every person in that room to hear. Your Honor, I have one condition of my own. I nodded. Effective today, Brandon's access to every family financial account, every professional connection, and every door that has ever opened because it carried the name Mercer behind it is suspended. All of it. He looked at his son directly. You will stand on what you have built yourself. When we find out what that is, we will go from there. Brandon Mercer stared at his father and said nothing. For the first time since that morning, there was nothing left to perform. The gavel came down. The silence that followed was the heaviest I have felt in 30 years on this bench. Not the silence of a room that has nothing to say. The silence of a room that has said everything and is now simply bearing witness to what comes next. Officers approached the defense table. Brandon stood. He reached instinctively for his jacket, that same habitual smoothing of the lapel that witnesses had described on the steps of the VA. Then his hands stopped mid-motion and dropped to his sides, as if the gesture had suddenly shown him something about himself he was not prepared to see. General Raymond Mercer crossed the courtroom and stopped in front of his son. 4 stars, 40 years, and a face that contained more pain than any battlefield had ever put there. He did not reach for Brandon immediately. He looked at him first. A long, steady, unflinching look. The look of a man conducting a full and honest inventory of every decision, every absence, every moment of his own life that had contributed, however distantly, to this room, this morning, this sun. Then he gripped Brandon's shoulder with one hand. "I have given orders," he said quietly, "that cost men their lives. I have made decisions in the field that I have carried with me every day since. But this is the hardest order I have ever given." His voice held. "But only just. Face this, all of it, every hour, every day, every conversation you don't want to have. Come out the other side as someone worthy of the uniform you have spent your whole life benefiting from without ever earning." Brandon's composure broke completely and without warning, not gradually, all at once. The way things collapse when the last remaining support finally gives way. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said, his voice stripped of everything else. "I'm so sorry." The general pulled him close. "I know," he said. "Now show me." Across the courtroom, Harold Washington rose from his seat, slowly, with his cane, with his hip brace, with the full and quiet weight of everything he was and everything he had survived. He looked at General Mercer across that room and rendered a single, small, deliberate nod. The veterans in the gallery rose to their feet, one by one, without a word spoken between them. Nobody saluted. Nobody needed to. The room had already said everything that needed to be said, in a language that required no translation. 6 months later, Brandon Mercer walked out of the county correctional facility carrying one bag. No car service waiting, no attorney with next steps, no family connections ready to smooth the transition back into comfort. He had asked for none of those things, and that fact alone told you more about what those 6 months had produced than anything else could. The 400 hours at VA hospitals and veteran care homes had not been performed at a manageable distance. He had sat beside beds. He had listened. He had spent hours in the company of men Harold Washington's age and older, men who moved slowly and remembered everything, men who had given years of their lives to something larger than themselves and received, in many cases, very little in return. Men who had been raised never to complain about either. He had heard stories of service and sacrifice, and the particular quiet suffering that comes from people who were taught to endure without asking for acknowledgement. And somewhere in the accumulated weight of all those hours and all those conversations, something in Brandon Mercer had shifted in a way that 120 days in a correctional facility alone could never have produced. He and Harold Washington met at a veteran community luncheon 8 weeks after his release. Both men had requested the meeting independently, through separate channels, without knowing the other had already made the same request. What passed between them remained private. Both described it afterward using the same word: healing. Washington became, in the months that followed, something close to an informal mentor to Brandon, meeting occasionally, offering the kind of guidance that can only come from someone who has chosen grace over grievance and understands exactly what that choice costs. Brandon's video statement, recorded plainly, no styling, no second takes, no attorney present, was seen by millions. He went on to speak at veteran outreach programs, telling his story without softening a single detail, without excusing a single moment, and without leaving out the part where the man he knocked to the ground on a set of concrete steps chose, without any obligation, to help him become someone better. General Raymond Mercer attended every one of those sessions. He sat in the back row each time, full uniform, 4 stars, saying nothing, needing to say nothing, watching his son become, one measured step at a time, someone finally worthy of both of them. I have thought about this case every day since that gavel came down. I think about General Mercer rising from that 5th row, not to defend his son, not to leverage 40 years of decorated service on behalf of the family name, but to stand before that bench and ensure, with his own voice and his own presence, that nothing in that courtroom was softened, that nothing was made easier. I think about what that cost him, not politically, not professionally, but in the private accounting that only a parent can make, the quiet reckoning with every choice, every absence, every moment along the way that led to this room on this morning. That may be the most courageous thing I have ever witnessed in this courtroom. Not the medals, not the 40 years, but that moment, that choice. I think about Harold Washington, 80 years old, hip, in a brace, the mark of a laceration still visible above his eye, received on the steps of the building that exists to serve him, rising slowly from his seat with his cane and offering that small, deliberate nod across a packed and weeping courtroom to the father of the man who put him in a hospital, a gesture of grace so freely given that every person who witnessed it was made simultaneously smaller by their own limitations and larger by the reminder of what human beings are capable of. And I think about a young man who walked into my courtroom on a Wednesday morning, having never once in 30 years been genuinely required to account for himself, who walked out of a correctional facility 6 months later carrying the first thing he had ever truly earned, the slow, hard, irreversible knowledge of who he actually is and who he is still capable of becoming. Real honor is not inherited. It cannot be passed down with a name or a rank or a row of decorations on someone else's chest. Real strength is not the ability to knock an old man down on a set of concrete steps. It is the willingness to be brought to your knees by the full weight of what you did, and to stand back up as someone the people you hurt no longer have any reason to fear. Harold Washington survived a war at 19 years old. He survived what happened to him on those steps. And then he chose, without being asked, without any obligation, to offer the hand that helped the person who hurt him find his way back. That is not weakness. That is the particular strength that comes from a person who has decided, somewhere deep and permanent, exactly what kind of man he is going to be. If this story stayed with you, if you believe that no rank, no name, and no family legacy places any person above accountability, stay close. There are more cases worth telling. I'll be right here.